there is a particular kind of exhaustion that nobody really talks about. The kind that comes not from doing too much, but from wanting too much from the wrong people. You know the feeling. You say something vulnerable and wait. You achieve something meaningful and look around for one specific face to light up. You bend, you adjust, you shrink, you perform, all in the quiet, desperate hope that this time they will finally see you, finally choose you, finally make you feel like you are enough. And when it doesn't come, when they remain unmoved or indifferent or critical, something inside you doesn't say they're not the right person. Instead, it whispers, "I'm not enough." That whisper is not new. That whisper has a history. And understanding that history might be the most important thing you ever do for yourself. The psychology behind why we chase validation from the wrong people is not about weakness. It is not about desperation. And it is certainly not about a lack of self-awareness. In fact, many of the people who find themselves trapped in this pattern are deeply self-aware individuals. People who feel everything profoundly, who care immensely, and who have simply learned somewhere early in life that love is something you earn, that belonging is conditional, that your worth is a moving target decided by someone else. It often begins in childhood, in the earliest relationships we have, with a parent, a caregiver, a sibling, an authority figure, where love felt inconsistent. Maybe you had a parent who was emotionally unavailable, not cruel, not absent in the physical sense, but just unreachable. You could never quite predict what mood they'd be in. Some days they were warm and engaged, and other days they were cold and distracted. And you, as a child with no framework to understand adult behavior, did what all children do. You assumed it was about you. You started scanning. You started adjusting. You became incredibly attuned to other people's emotional states because your emotional safety depended on it. Psychologists call this hypervigilance, a state of heightened sensitivity to the moods, reactions, and needs of others. And while it was adaptive then, it becomes a wound that walks into every relationship you have as an adult. What happens neurologically and emotionally is that your brain associates love with uncertainty. It learns that affection is something that must be pursued, not simply received. And this creates what attachment theorists call an anxious attachment style, a pattern where you feel most intensely connected to people who are emotionally inconsistent with you, because that inconsistency mirrors the first emotional environment you ever knew. The warm days followed by the cold ones, the approval followed by the silence. It feels like home even when it is hurting you. This is why so often we do not chase validation from the people who freely give it. The friend who always shows up, who never makes you guess, who tells you clearly that you matter, they can feel almost too easy, too safe. And the brain that learned love through pursuit finds it difficult to trust what it didn't have to work for. So instead, you find yourself orbiting the emotionally unavailable partner, the critical parent whose approval always seems just out of reach, the friend who is sometimes wonderful and sometimes makes you feel invisible, the colleague whose validation would mean everything precisely because they rarely give it. You are not drawn to them despite their inconsistency. On a subconscious level, you are drawn to them because of it. This pattern plays out in relationships in ways that can be heartbreaking to witness from the outside and even more painful to live through. You might find yourself replaying a conversation over and over, wondering what you said wrong, changing the way you dress, speak, or present yourself in hopes of finally landing on the version of you that they will approve of, minimizing your own pain because you don't want to seem too needy, excusing behavior that genuinely hurts you, telling yourself you're being too sensitive, when really you're just desperately trying to protect the connection that your nervous system has decided is essential to your survival. And the cruelest part is that the more they withhold, the more you want it. Because every occasional moment of warmth acts like a variable reward, unpredictable, intermittent, and deeply, neurologically addictive. The impact of this pattern on mental well-being is significant. When your sense of self-worth lives outside of you, in other people's opinions, reactions, and choices, you are always at the mercy of things you cannot control. Your mood becomes dependent on how someone else responded to your message, Your self-esteem rises and falls based on whether or not someone acknowledged your effort. You lose access to your own inner voice because you've spent so long listening for someone else's. Over time, this creates a chronic undercurrent of anxiety, a fragile sense of self, and a deep, aching loneliness. Not because you are alone, but because even in connection, you never quite feel seen for who you actually are. You are seen for the version of yourself you've performed, and some part of you knows it. What makes this even more layered is the shame that surrounds it, because somewhere along the way, the culture taught us that needing validation is embarrassing, that wanting to be loved and chosen is a character flaw. So on top of the original wound, we carry the shame of having it. We call ourselves pathetic. We tell ourselves to just get over it, and that shame doesn't heal anything. It only drives the behavior deeper underground, where it continues to run the show without ever being examined. But here is what is true, and what matters more than any of the rest of it. The fact that you seek connection so deeply is not your pathology. It is your humanity. The longing to be seen, to be chosen, to matter to someone. That is not weakness. That is one of the most fundamental needs a human being has. The issue was never that you wanted love. The issue is that you learned to look for it in places that could never actually hold it, and to keep looking even when the evidence was clear. That is a learned pattern, and learned patterns can be unlearned. The beginning of that unlearning is not about cutting off the people who can't give you what you need, though sometimes that becomes necessary. It begins with something quieter and far more radical. It begins with becoming, slowly, the consistent presence you are always looking for. It begins with noticing when you are editing yourself for someone's approval and asking, gently and without judgment, what am I afraid will happen if I just say what's true? It begins with letting the safe people in, the ones who don't make you guess, who don't require a performance, who show up without conditions, and practicing the terrifying act of trusting them. It begins with understanding that your nervous system learned a very specific definition of love a long time ago, and that definition was written in conditions that were never fair to you. You didn't choose to internalize it. You didn't choose the emotional environment you were shaped by. But you are here now, aware, awake, and reading these words. And awareness, real, compassionate, unflinching awareness, is always the first act of healing. You are not too much. You have simply been pouring yourself into containers that were never built to hold you. And somewhere there are people, and more importantly, there is a version of yourself that can. The work is not to need less. The work is to finally believe that you deserve what you've always been looking for, and to stop looking for it in the one place it was never going to come from. That is not giving up. That is finally, gently choosing yourself.